And so I'm happy to introduce our first speaker, Professor Ann Carpenter, who is Associate Professor of Theology at St. Mary's College in California, where it's just about 7 o'clock in the morning. But we're very glad she's woken up maybe a little bit earlier in order to join us to give her paper, The Twilight of What is Conscious and Not Objectified, Lonerganian Gestures of Postcolony. And after Dr. Carpenter finishes her talk, the respondent will be Benjamin Lujan, who is a PhD candidate at the University of St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto. And after that, we will open up the session for questions. So Dr. Carpenter will speak for about half an hour, Benjamin for up to 10 minutes, and then we'll have discussion. So Dr. Carpenter, thank you very much.
Thank you, Darren. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, thank you. All right, I'm just going to begin. I realized then why you will always be a monster, Corey says to Bishan near the end of Ramvi's comic called These Savage Shores. Corey is a member of a small indigenous community in India. It is the 17th century. Colonial England lengthens its reach in India by the day. We, the reader, are here to witness a personal and a peopled tragedy made metaphor. An English vampire has turned Corey into a vampire. Bishan, who loves Corey, who loves him, is not a vampire. He is something else. He is a Rakshasa, a human-like monster from Indian folklore that appears in Buddhism, Hinduism, and Jainism. So we've got two, they're sort of like vampire-ish. So here we are. These lovers are now both monsters. But Corey offers a crucial and tragic distinction, one that will ambiguously cleave their love forever. You were never made, Bishan, but I was made by the choices of monsters. In this claim, truth and metaphor breach one another, and a comic book's visual play with monstrous lore becomes a serious word of truth. Frantz Fanon assembles conceptuality for something like Corey's distinction, so her distinction between you were never made, I was made, when he says, the Malagasy has ceased to exist. The reactions and the behavior patterns to which the arrival of the European in Madagascar gave rise were not tacked on to a pre-existing set. There was no addition to the earlier psychic whole. Colonization for Fanon is not an addition, but a making wrought by decisions. The Malagasy no longer exists. A colonized subjectivity, a new creation, neither an ex nihilo nor an addendum, now exists. In the concise language of these savage shores, nothing will ever be the same again. And that is my dilemma for us today. What sense can be made of the making that colonialism makes? What sense can be discovered in the I was made of the human subjectivities wrought by colonial conquest? How does Lonergan gesture toward this sense in me, the one who asks? Today I want to borrow a page from Bernard Lonergan and make a move to interiority. It is a kind of experiment, a formulation in the middle of its own attempt. I want to see if this move to interiority can be understood at all in the wake of colonial history. Fanon himself moves in a psychoanalytic direction. My direction is Lonerganian. So, can I conceive of a turn to the I in the I was made of our history? Can I, as it were, speak the turn to interiority under the burden of such a history? For Fanon, the work of colonialism bears in itself a double conceit designed to conceal the basic violence of the colony. There is the conceit I have already named, that colonialism is a kind of addition to a whole. There is that conceit inversion, that colonialism adds nothing to the colonizer, who is, as it were, already and always whole. But the reality is otherwise. The feeling of inferiority of the colonized, Fanon explains, is the correlative to the European's feeling of superiority. Let us have the courage to say it outright. It is the racist who creates his inferior. In Enrique Dussel, this creation includes an ex post facto reversal, where the innocence of indigenous peoples, who after all did not ask or deserve to be colonized, is imputed onto the colonizer, and the guilt of the colonizer imputed onto the colonized. Violence, already committed, receives its warrant. For Lonergan, sin is absurd. Sin is radically unintelligible. It has no reason to be done. Had it reason to be done, it would not be sin. On one level, a certain intending of some kind of good occurs in the human action that we call sin, though not the necessary one, not the necessary good, not, that is, the good that is demanded by human reason, which reason can only reason about derivatively in its imitation and affirmation of divine reason. To put it another way, since we are speaking ultimately of the universe that God intends, and therefore of order, to do the good is to act in accordance with eternal law. Sin, Lonergan insists in Grace and Freedom, therefore must be understood as a withdrawal from the ordinance of the divine intellect. I do will a good of a kind, but not that particular good that accords with my reason, proximately, and with God's, primarily. When, then, says Lonergan, it is said that moral lapse is objective falsity, it is not implied that moral lapse is not objective. Obviously, it is objective, and so it admits the subjective truth to be found in empirical affirmations of its existence and in empirical classifications of its kinds. What objective falsity excludes is understanding. End quote. Normally, when we navigate the sins of our past or our present, we analogize the concept of anachronism. But Lonergan shows us how historical context, upon which anachronism and its analogies rely, in fact breaks down as an explanation of sin. It breaks down mainly because sin cannot be explained. But it also breaks down because this inexplicability imbricates our knowing. It imbricates the very fabric of the historical situation from which our minds, as instruments, must draw in order to think at all. The impact of colonialism here is profound. To recall Fanon, there was no addition to the earlier psychic whole. In other words, new historical situations have arisen, and from them subjectivities that are, if not new, nevertheless subjects whose materials for operation are, can only be, the new situation. Writing in an American context, James Baldwin sees whiteness itself as a kind of making that always bears the shadow of what it conceals, fundamentally what some people have done to other people, a doing that transforms these some and these others into white and black. Notice the decisions of temporality and responsibility, for example, in this extended explanation from Baldwin's On Being White and Other Lies. So I'm going to read a few sentences. America became white. The people who, as they claim, settled the country became white because of the necessity of denying the black presence and justifying the black subjugation. Because they think they are white, they do not dare confront the ravage and the lie of their history. Because they think they are white, they cannot allow themselves to be tormented by the suspicion that all men are brothers. Because they think they are white, they are looking for, or bombing into existence, stable population, cheerful natives, and cheap labor. Because they think they are white, they believe, as even no child believes, in the dream of safety. Because they think they are white, however vociferous they may be, and however multitudinous, they are as speechless as Lot's wife, looking backward, changed into a pillar of salt. End quote. The speechlessness of being white, the speechlessness, that is, of deciding not to speak what is, for Baldwin, speaking the more of reality, and for Lonergan, we might say the more of human and divine reason. This is not the only speechlessness at hand. Akile Mbembe imagines the African masks sitting in European museums, often stripped of much of their original accompanying details and instruments. They are headless, and doubly, removed from the human faces that made and meant them, removed from the bodies of meaning that made and meant them. They sit mute, and rather permanently so. The worlds that enworlded them have ended. What, then, would or could giving them back mean? Mbembe offers a caution in order that such restitution not, quote, become an occasion for Europe to buy itself a good conscience at a cheap price, end quote. It must coincide with the enactment of a capacity for new connection. There is a certain speechlessness that is a refusal to evoke Lonergan of the desire to know. This speechlessness Baldwin associates in our present historical situation with thinking that one is white. This thinking is undergirded by actions that elaborate the basic refusal in various ways, making whiteness not real in a strictly Thomist sense, but able to sustain a version at least of Lonergan's objective falsity. It carries in itself a particular refusal of particular human persons as historical subjects, and we call these subjects black. In something like these overlaps of falsities, Mbembe calls that which is racial phantasmagorical. But there is more than this refusal at hand. For what Mbembe adverts to when he describes African masks and their unspeakableness is not only a reference to the words that go on unheard by the white world, nor only a reference to lies. No, he adverts to the constituting and mediating worlds of meaning that have been permanently ruptured and changed. There is something colossal, says Mbembe, something unaccountable and almost priceless that has been lost for good, and that is attested by the life of all our objects in captivity, just as that of all those of ours inside the carceral landscape of yesterday and of today. I'm reminded of a passage in Method on the Human Good. There, Lonergan explains that feelings are responses to values. But these feelings and these values can be bent out of shape, turn neurotic, echo historical problems, and otherwise confess the crevatus of human nature in its facticity. It is much better, Lonergan counsels, to take full cognizance of one's feelings, however deplorable they may be, than to brush them aside, overrule them, ignore them. To take cognizance of them makes it possible for one to know oneself, to uncover the inattention, obtuseness, silliness, irresponsibility that gave rise to the feeling one does not want, and to correct the aberrant attitude. Not to take cognizance of them is to leave them in the twilight of what is conscious but not objectified. In the long run, there results a conflict between the self as conscious and, on the other hand, the self as objectified. End quote. We have thus arrived at that point in the play where a character says the play's name, and so we know it's important. What interests me about what Lonergan says here is how necessary but also how futile it becomes to speak the truth about oneself to oneself. At one angle, our taking cognizance opens the way for possibility. A revelation allows for new decision. But Lonergan emphasizes the difficulty of the deed. We are not willing to enact this experience. Then there is the ever-partial nature of the withdrawal from unauthenticity. Human authenticity, Lonergan explains in Method, is never some pure and serene and secure possession. It is ever a withdrawal from unauthenticity, and every successful withdrawal only brings to light the need for still further withdrawals. In other words, there will be a perpetual conflict between the self as conscious, which is to say the self that experiences, and the self as objectified, which is to say the self that knows itself in various objectifications. As with the individual, so the world, which individuals together make. It is helpful to conceive of this problem at the remove of a certain pastness, a pastness that has a way of creeping up on scholarship as it's present. So it is that Maya Kotrositz, in her book Rethinking Early Christian Identity, challenges the very notion that identity is a helpful instrument for understanding early first century texts that we today call Christian. Christian identity, she explains, is a strategic term in modern scholarship, if epistemologically contradictory, indexing universality and continuity, as well as the impossibility of the same. Rather than taking up the term and its perplexities, Kotrositz surveys several texts on affective or connotative felt entanglements of immanent and transcendent desires, and diasporic or imperially ruptured and structured grounds. So affective, diasporic. The results are textures of coherence, contradictoriness, and struggle. The result is a yearning for belonging that is as framed by its irrevocable losses, so Jerusalem, and so Israel's shattering in 70 AD looms profoundly in all the texts. So it's shaped by that as much as it is shaped by its confused alterity. Alterity from the Roman Imperium. For the Roman Imperium makes the losses, but also shapes the conceptual striving for coherence. Absolutes, a Christianity absolutely handed over to the Imperium, or a pure fragment of Christianity set against the Imperium, become impossible. Not only impossible, but also inadequate for understanding belonging that is informed by diaspora. Kotrositz argues, Christian belonging, however unsettled or fractious, has been generated and regenerated through violence. But the relationship between any belonging and violence may be less straightforward than identity models might have us believe. In diaspora, she explains later, one's loyalties are necessarily doubled and conflated, ever in unexpected ways. This reminds me, as an aside, of Lonergan's somewhat impatient deconstruction of the idea that there is a Hellenistic mind and a Hebraic mind, models that utterly fail to describe what Kotrositz might call belonging. And this deconstruction occurs in Lonergan's De Deo Trino Pars Dogmatica. But for Kotrositz, one of the keys to why scholars care at all about these early texts in their relationships to the Roman Imperium is fundamentally present tense. We care because we know what happened later. We care because we must deal with ourselves. Long after the Book of Acts, she says, and in the wake of other empires, a global and multi-ethnic Christian constituency tries to reckon not only with its own vastness, but also with its own unfortunate coalitions with various political powers. Thus, the specters of Rome and Israel do not just denote historical entities, but all that we hope, fear, despise, or mourn about ourselves. End quote. There is, in other words, our own struggle waged across the texts of the dead, a struggle between the self as conscious and the self as objectified. The trouble now, the trouble for our time, is gaining the measure of the world now made. There is, I fear, no going backward. Or perhaps I discover a kind of hope, that unwinding time is impossible, that I'll not find that gem of purity in the stone layers of history. The sharp shape which, shining, would explain my own being Christian in a way that I could tolerate without guilt. I can't do that. A kind of hope that perhaps the only two sharp, shining hearts possible for me to find in history are that of God and the one made immaculate by God. So my hope, which itself would have to be divine, must face this ambiguity and know that even my righteous desire to track every wrong historical turn strives, almost madly, to wash from my hands that damned spot that is invisible and that remains. We have then a problem. It is the problem of human history in its grandeur et misère. We have the problem of colonialism today, which scholars are wont to describe as entanglement, as a history with undersides, a sort of spatial metaphorical cacophony trying to provide a context for sin, the radical unintelligible, and the patterns by which it bears the face of intelligibility. I've described aspects of this problem. This problem is, at least partly, something analogous to the problem posed in Lonergan's opening to Insight, the problem of an invitation to a personal, decisive act. But of course, Insight is a book about knowledge, and how an account of knowledge, which Insight is, can be an invitation to a personal, decisive act, which Insight also is in a sense the whole mystery and trouble of Insight, summarized. How it relates to this other problem that I've been discussing is intimated by that twilight of Lonergan's that I've mentioned, that twilight where conflict emerges between self as conscious and self as objectified. And since our time grows short, allow me to step forward into a more poetic mode of speaking, to try to say what it is that I mean. So the trouble of being human is that human being is difficult to know in its being, and not because it's difficult in the sense of a difficult arithmetic problem, but difficult in the sense that this being is polymorphic and evinced of a crevatus that suffers a fundamental unwillingness to know itself at all. Against the self-affirmation of a consciousness that at once is empirical, intellectual, and rational, says Lonergan, there stands the native bewilderment of the existential subject. It is a bewilderment of many kinds, since our composition as individuals and as consciousnesses is itself composite, a composition, a dynamic unity and not a monad. But for Lonergan, affirm ourselves we must in our complexity, which is to say, appropriate ourselves we must, or the struggle of our struggling is lost in its own midst. Know thyself, says the inscription at the oracle at Delphi. And Lonergan says something like this: but to affirm oneself as conscious, as a creature that attends, understands, reasons, is not the same as knowing the contents of a book, or rather it is that, like that knowing, if we know that the knowing to be had is had in the mind that affirms, in that very act of affirmation. Books do not know, but humans do. Humans know by way of operations that do not resemble each other, but that spontaneously assemble according to a unity, whose unity is a transcending dynamism, a polymorphism intending beyond itself. People cannot be studied from a distance, says Baldwin. It is perfectly possible that we cannot be studied at all. God's anguish, perhaps, upon being confronted with his creation. People certainly cannot be studied from a safe distance, or from the distance which we call safety. End quote. And then in that beautiful and daring way he has, Baldwin places upon his reader the burden of a responsibility that involves, among other things, a confrontation with oneself, with its fishing by other selves. No one is or can be the other, he says. There is nothing in the other, from the depths to the heights, which is not to be found in me. The point I'm trying to make is a point had only if you yourself have it, if you conceive it yourself. That is, if you affirm yourself to be this polymorphism by knowing yourself as such, an achievement that will require becoming aware of the operations as you yourself spontaneously operate them. It is a strange thing that I'm trying to say, since it seems so self-involved, since it is so irrepressibly hinged on everything that I can't have done for you, and that I myself can only be to you as a kind of testimony, inasmuch as I do it too. But I do not think Lonergan was concerned with individuals as such, not if what he says is true. If self-appropriation is real, then it is not about the self merely, but about our responsibility before one another, about that twilight where self as conscious becomes objectified. So if we sense that something must be done about the tragedy of our present situation, then Lonergan tells us that we must ask with a kind of ascetic repetition about the ones who know and who act. About these ones, I will only say one more admittedly mysterious thing. Self-appropriation requires tasting the taste of an infinite desire that cannot have itself as its ultimate object. On this we absolutely depend. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carpenter. I'll turn it over now to Benjamin.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Hans, for the paper. So I just prepared very few remarks that I just want to share. So I'm going to read them a little bit to organize my thoughts. Okay? I'm going to try to just stay within the 10 minutes. So reading Anne's piece, I feel like thinking about what we make ourselves by our choices and how we live in a context of people being made by colonialism, all of us in different ways. I feel like thinking about the moral and existential dimensions of my life, in other words, but in relation to its concrete social embodiment, one of colonialism, which includes, for example, much patriarchy, heteronormativity, misogyny, racism, and classism. In my understanding, Anne's piece highlights that knowing myself as knower and chooser, Anne's piece highlights that knowing myself as knower and chooser, to knowingly choose to act based on that knowledge often does not translate into doing that. Paraphrasing St. Paul, I know well that often I do the evil I know. I know I don't want, and I don't do that good I know I want. The best dental hygienist does not necessarily have the cleaner teeth. In fact, knowing something too well can become a source of a false sense of security or crazy attachment to what we consider most dear, whether it's God, Lonergan studies, or the people we love, which can easily turn into obsessions and fears, not that obvious to us, or something like the opposite sometimes, much self-aware frustration with ourselves, as a constant reminder that the higher we're climbing, the harder we keep falling. Related to this, I remember the picture of the gates of a Carthusian monastery that had words that said something like this: once entering, you must become a saint, or you will never be one. For those who try to live self-knowingly committed to the good, sometimes this feels like an all or nothing type of affair. Going all heaven or going all hell type of thing. This is connected to our personal lived experiences of the fact that with great power, with great self-knowledge, we might say, comes great or greater responsibility, Spider-Man style. Or those who received much are expected to give much, as others say. This is so to say, we might know ourselves at a moral level at a lot more than average, but we know we don't live a lot better than average. What's going on? I am reminded of Lonergan's words that in our concrete lives, paraphrasing, our struggles to live responsibly is what lead us to try to know ourselves and ultimately to appropriate ourselves. I'm drawing here on concretely, existentially speaking, religious conversion leads to moral conversion, which leads to intellectual conversion, which is self-appropriation. Just 1 second. So, in light of this priority or fundamentality of concrete life, I'm reading Anne's paper reminds me of Lonergan's words in Mission in the Spirit about the experience of grace that grounds religious conversion. In Mission in the Spirit, he says, Lonergan says, the experience of grace is as large as the Christian experience of life. We might say as the human experience of life. It is the experience of man's capacity for self-transcendence, of his unrestricted openness to the intelligible, the true, the good. And Lonergan also says this, it is experience of a twofold frustration of that capacity. The frustration of life in a world distorted by sin. The frustrations of one's incapacity to break with one's own evil ways. So it seems to me that these two things are often connected. A realization of our own frustrations or incapacities to break with our own evil ways in light of the fact that we're living in a world that is distorted by sin or its current forms. This leads me to say that realizing these two things, we might say that despite all our self-knowledge, it seems that we're not good enough to make the world a little bit less shitty than what it is. But connected to this again, and inspired by the emphasis on the concreteness of or immediacy of the experience of sin that the paper talked about, or the experience of evil, really, I'm reminded of this immediacy also of, or concreteness of the experience of grace, and how in our concrete lives, there is a sense of immediacy or spontaneity that is there. So not only sin is embodied and concrete and immediate, grace is too. Getting to the end now. Just 1 second. While self-appropriation at a cognitive and moral level is crucial for identifying and dealing with self-contradictory positions, for example, that inform discussions on many controversial topics, including the effects of colonialism, surely this can be very helpful for thinking better about these issues theologically, though that is good. In our concrete lives, self-appropriation sometimes falls short, as I have pointed out, and maybe Anne's paper has been pointing out too. Ultimately, in terms of self-knowledge, and drawing on Anne's focus on this emphasis on the absolute, or relying, trusting on this absolute, move to point out with liberation theologians that speaking of knowing oneself or knowing God, they say usually, liberation theologians, we know God by doing justice. So maybe we know ourselves by doing justice, maybe not knowing ourselves in the self-appropriation type of knowing that Lonergan is talking about, but we live ourselves authentically by doing justice. So when I think, to finish up, of the hope that the paper speaks about, a hope in God, I can't help but thinking about that this hope in God translates as, again, liberation theologians reminds us, creating reasons for having hopes, for having hope. So that we can say to people, yes, there is hope, that there is such a God that cares for all in the midst of colonial violence. In other words, having hope in God concretely translates in our efforts to show that there is actually hope, that there is a God that loves people in the midst of this colonial violence. So it's the issue of theodicy here that we're confronted, and our hope in God, it has to be translated in that kind of concrete creating of reasons for truly believing that it makes sense that there is hope, that it makes sense that there is a God, when life speaks volumes to the contrary, often. So I want to finishing up there. I don't have a final resolution or conclusion, unfortunately. I just wanted to share some thoughts and to thank everybody, and Anne in particular, for the opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you both, and thank you for starting off our day with a very stimulating presentation and response. I would maybe, before opening it up to everyone, I would just ask Professor Carpenter if you have any comments in response to Ben's response.
Yeah, that was so lovely. I was very moved. That was wonderful. I'm so glad you moved to the necessity of grace and the necessity of sort of grace driving us toward concrete acts of justice. It's a lovely and gentle push at me, I think. And so I'm very grateful for it. I took a bunch of notes, so thank you.
And if there are any other questions, we can do this in two ways. There's a raise hand function. If you go up to the top of your screen, you'll see a hand. And I see Patrick has his hand up, and Kate, I'm sorry, Kate, do you want to ask your question?
So I'll start in a kind of narrative fashion. In sense of affective response, I just felt deeply connected to the way that you articulated history. And I'm Eastern Orthodox, and so the fact that you talked about the fracturing that happens because of Roman occupation and the layered concept of what we understand Christian history to be, being intensely marked by that imperial colonial existence, I just found to be deeply moving, and it opens us up to questions about how we conceive certain categories that we don't question, like language. And I had my screen off, but I'm just like clapping and whooping, because when you mention Lonergan's categorization of Hellenism and Hebraicism, I'm Syrian, and I've always resisted that kind of bifurcation because, of course, Hellenized people groups, it would be like saying that speaking English indicates you're British, right? And so while we sort of apply decolonial methodologies to the present, we very often neglect antiquity, and we neglect precisely the early modern period's take on antiquity. And so the fact that you wove that into the conversation about this colonized mentality with Fanon, and wove in that there's some complexity and diversity involved in how we're kind of categorizing Hellenism, categorizing Hebraic or Semitic people groups, I just found to be so deep, and it really resonated with me. So I wonder if you might talk about the ways in which you might imagine taking this conversation toward the elements of early Christianity that we usually discuss as just inherited, and ways that you might imagine your project kind of off-centering that take.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been really interesting to both read about theories of diaspora from for example the Black Caribbean, and see them applied to early Christianity, because it shows the ways that diasporic communities are made by the basic violence of their experience, and it sort of it parts them permanently from their past, which now becomes this nostalgic object that can never really be had again. And very frequently, the tools at hand are also imperial tools, and so there's this constant complicated dance to do. For example, that there's a Black Caribbean is always forever marked by the fact of colonialism. And so I think I think what is helpful about Lonergan in his emphasis on what can be affirmed instead of on what bucket to put things in, because he always frowns at that as conceptualism, and that's just not how the concrete world is. There can be multiple affirmations of a single event or object or person that overlap, and so I'm not really constrained to say, is this a Christian text or not? Does the Book of Acts sell out to Rome or not? It's probably a mess of affirmations and negations I'm going to have to make. I don't know if that helps, but that's, yeah.
Okay, do I go on? Okay. So.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, please.
Okay. Thank you so much, Anne, for this excellent paper. I mean, if I had my cameras on, you would have seen my response. The paper resonates with me because I speak English because of colonialism. Is it a good thing? To a large extent, yes. Is it bad? To a large extent, yes. Okay. But the area I want to touch on is on the feeling of inferiority. And I want to say that it is true. What it does is it demeans the self. And it puts the self almost in a constant need to reaffirm the self. It makes what is ordinary to become even a little bit difficult. And the most, I don't want to use the word annoying, but frustrating aspect of it is that it is perpetuated in many and in various ways. Again, I don't want to say either conscious or unconscious racism. I don't want to use that word. But there are so many ways, either by political policies, either by the way people carry themselves, that make the others to be continuously feel inferiorized. And then what happens is that the continuation of colonial mentalities and superiority complex has become so ingrained that the perpetuators think it is normal behavior. So I don't want to ask you what is the solution. No, I don't want to ask you that, because I don't think there is any solution. I think that each person just has to work on it in his own or in her own ways. But I just want to affirm that it is true. Thank you.
Thanks, Joseph. Is there any, Anne, go ahead. Oh, no, I saw you.
Just thank you. Thank you very much.
Benjamin, anything? No, okay. Are there any other questions for Anne or any other points for discussion? Joseph, I see your hand is up, but I think that's probably leftover, is it? Okay. Yeah, Benjamin, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to resonate with Joseph's words too, the issue of colonialism and the creation of, or the forced creation of different selves, right, that the paper was alluding at. And Joseph put it very eloquently. He said there are good things and bad things, you know, about speaking English, right? And also when he concluded by saying this is a very sort of concrete, personal type of question about who is the self, who in what way has been made, let's say, by colonialism, let's say, right? And I think this is an area that more and more, hopefully in Lonergan studies, we're getting into it, right? And with a level of depth that is does justice to the complexity and the concreteness, right? Sometimes, for example, there's that assumption that, you know, of course, colonialism is, of course, is terrible, but what we have been created, we do the best we can with what we have sometimes, and what we have we can change. And it's not just colonialism, or let's say the history of the Americas, but the history of the world sometimes is the result of different new peoples and new societies or realities that have come about because of violence and because of oppression. And I think I just want to, you know, affirm with Joseph too, this area, let's say, in Lonergan studies too, because I find it very relevant for today, and also a push for relationship building in Lonergan studies if we're serious about colonialism with you know, peoples of color and so on, to enrich our conversations. That's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. Thank you, Anne, for your paper, your wonderful paper that addressed some, and I hope sets the tone for much of our discussion for the rest of the day. So we were wise to invite you to speak first, because I think it will really help our discussions for the rest of this morning. And thank you, Benjamin, for your very thoughtful response.